time zones, good afternoon. And to our esteemed and gracious speaker today, Dr. Dan Binkley, good evening, or I'm going to attempt this, Dan, Gukfeld.
Very nice.
Try this next one. Dan is coming to us live from Umeå, Sweden, where I think it's around 8 o'clock in the evening. So Dan, we owe you a special thanks even before you give your talk. I'm Michelle Schoenberger. I'm the research program lead at the USDA National Agroforestry here in Lincoln. And once upon a time, a fellow forest soil scientist in training along with Dan Binkley in the hallowed halls of Oregon State, the best forestry school out there. A little bit about Dan. Dan has been a professor of forest ecology and soils at Duke University and Colorado State University for over 30 years. At CSU, he is the professor for forest ecology in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability and at the Natural Resources Ecology Lab. With his many, many students and colleagues from around the world, Dan has actually worked on a wide range of projects, from natural forests and soil dynamics in northern Alaska, to ecosystem production in intensively managed eucalypts in Hawaii and Brazil. His works and writings have dealt with a wide but interrelated array of topics. He's published on water quality, soils and ecosystems, biogeochemistry, ecophysiology, forest restoration, to landscape management, ecology, and forest nutrition. Now, Dan will readily admit he's always been one to relish the Easter egg hunt of research, but he's also one that has worked throughout his career to combine basic and applied research in ways to inform his students and all those involved in the decisions, policies, and programs of land management. The Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry has named Dr. Binkley as this year's holder of the Wallenberg Professorship. The purpose of the Wallenberg Professorship is to establish ties with prominent foreign scientists who can contribute towards the renewal of Swedish science in the green sector and to universities and academic institutions. This is a very, very big honor. And indeed, it is an honor for us here today to have him speaking to us. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Dan Binkley. Dan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, for that gracious introduction, and thanks to Sean for all the arrangements that went behind this webinar. I hope it all goes well. He's trained me, I think, well, and we'll see how it goes. The topic I'm covering today is Ode to the O Horizon, the uniqueness of forest soils. We all know about O Horizons. One way or another, if we deal with forests, they're always underfoot anywhere we go in a forest. But I wanted to bring up a few long-standing things that might be worth reminding us, as well as perhaps some novel things towards the end. This was originally developed as a Sergey Wild lecture, invited by the Soil Science Society of America's Wildland Forest Soils Group. And they let me choose the topic I wanted, and this is the one that I thought would perhaps resonate best about why forest soils are one of the most interesting kinds of soils, and that's often about the O Horizon. So let's Sergey have some of the first words. The geologic substratum is dead and sterile. It cannot be parent to anything, let alone the animated entity called soil. When pedologists in the olden days brushed off that dead litter, they removed it with it not only the practical interests of silviculture, but even the scientific foundations of soil genesis. He was clearly a fan of O Horizons, Sergey. He was a famous forest soil scientist, one of the pioneers at the University of Wisconsin, by the way, and the author of one of the first forest soils textbooks that we have in English. He went on to say the surface layer of a forest soil presents a dynamic entity in which the energy of dead remains is transferred to new organisms and new compounds. Clearly an important horizon. And in many ways, this is what makes forest soil such an interesting domain for study, aside from all the reasons that soils in general are such a great domain for study. All right, here we go. So the O Horizon is only skin deep when it comes to soils, but in fact, that's where most of us find beauty when we look at a fellow human is skin deep. And so we don't want to suggest that all the physiology and chemistry and everything that happens below the surface of the O Horizon is unimportant. But we're going to be talking about beauty today, and that's often the O Horizon. But first I want to talk about why the O Horizon should be called an O Horizon and not that term forest floor that seems to have crept into ecology and even sometimes into soil science. So let's start by saying what are fossil fuels? If you ask Americans what are fossil fuels, they'll tell you they're dead dinosaur bones. 47% of Americans think fossil fuels come from decaying dinosaur bodies. Now, people who know more about it understand that it's the remains of plants that have cooked over time and whatnot. But the experts who deal with fossil fuels nowadays tend to call them coal, oil, and gas. They don't use the word fossil fuel because it gets in the way of clear communication. Whereas coal, oil, and gas, people know what we're talking about, and they don't confuse it with Dino or Dino the dinosaur. Because the hippo doesn't have a trunk, you might think that a fair comparison of these two animals would you should cut off the elephant's trunk. But if you did that, it wouldn't be an elephant anymore now, would it? Well, this is what a forest floor looks like, for those of you who haven't seen one. And this is what an O horizon looks like. If we call it an O horizon, people know we're talking soil here. We're not talking something that's distinct and separate from the rest of the soil. It's part of the soil. So how much carbon would accumulate in the soil or disappear from the soil if we put trees on it and then waited 30 years? Well, there are lots of people who've done studies like that, and here's the picture. There's that same tree in the background with the arrow, and 30 years later, a tremendous forest has grown at this site in Brazil. And you know, the soils have probably changed too. But if you ask people around the world who've sampled these kinds of situations, 90% of them forgot to sample the O horizon, and in many cases, the O horizon change has been more dramatic than the changes that happen in the mineral soil. And that's why we need to call it an O horizon, perhaps not a forest floor. So let's start with some obvious reasons why O horizons are beautiful things to ponder. Here's a classic study that just looks at the fluctuations in temperature in a soil that has no O horizon at the top versus a soil with O horizon at the top. With an O horizon, the temperature swings through the day are very small, and the temperature fluctuations at depth are really minimal. Without the O horizon, the soil surface that's exposed has tremendous swings in temperature and moisture and other features. So it's really very beautiful that these O horizons insulate the mineral horizons below. Perhaps more importantly, from a functional sense, is what that O horizon means for high intensity rainfalls. And I want to compare what happens in a forest when beetles kill trees, but of course the O horizon remains behind with all those dead trees, or a fire kills trees and it takes the O horizon with it. So here's what happens to the hydrograph, the water flow in the Fraser experimental forest when the beetles have killed the forest. It turns out the streams didn't notice. There's no change in peak flow, no change in floods, no change in base flow. The forest and the streams continue functioning as they should because the O horizon's still there. This is a bit more complicated graph, but the main story here is that when the 4 Mile fire burned an area in the Front Range of Colorado, the amount of water coming off that watershed during peak flows was about 4 or 5 times higher than those flood flows or the spring floods with snowmelt that happen in all the other watersheds of the Front Range. Taking away the O horizon dramatically increases our floods. And of course, not only the streams change after these fires, we get tremendous erosion off landscapes when the O horizon has been removed. Some of this extra erosion might be a result of hydrophobicity. As you know, the heating of the organic materials can lead to a little bit of a plasticizing of the mineral soil. But in fact, that's not really the biggest reason why we have so much erosion after fires. It really is the loss of the O horizon. And that hydrophobicity can be important, but not as important as the missing O. Well, there are great variations in O horizons as we walk around a landscape. Here's a plantation of white oak in a very uniform looking site in Texas. But if we sample the O horizon mass at one point, and then we move 2 meters away or 5 meters away or 10 meters away, we'd find that that O horizon mass was likely to be very different 5 meters away and especially 10 meters away than it is where we started. The O horizon is anything but constant as we walk across the forest. In fact, here's a map of an area just a bit smaller than an acre, showing what tremendous variation in the mass of the O horizon happens. Some areas have very little, some areas have quite a lot of O horizon mass. And there's got to be a pretty interesting story behind this variation, and it's a story we don't have many insights to at this point. Another point I enjoy reminding colleagues is that if you look at the variation of that O horizon around this forest, the standard deviation among samples as we move through space is about half O horizon mass for the whole stand. That's a lot of variation. But if we compare multiple stands that are planted at the same time on the same soil, it turns out the variability is really much less. So the coefficient of variation among stands is often much lower than the variability we find within a stand. And so anytime we want to detect changes over time and things like that, it's always good to keep in mind whether we're talking about variation within a stand or between stands. Over-horizons have beautiful variation if we're on one mountainside, but we walk around sampling different stands. Here's just one example from 10 different spruce fir forests. And the nitrogen supply for the trees is pretty much an over-horizon story in these sites. The mineral soil contributes some of the nitrogen the trees will use, but most of it comes from the over-horizon. In contrast, 10 aspen stands on the same mountainside, well, we got some more variation here in our stories. Some of the sites have about a consistent proportion of the nitrogen coming from the over-horizon versus the mineral horizon. Other sites have essentially the same amount of nitrogen available for trees to grow, but the proportion from the over-horizon is not the same. And then some sites have the same amount of nitrogen coming available from the mineral soil, but the difference in the over-horizon is so large that makes all the difference in the world to how these trees are going to be able to grow. Now, if we go from a single mountainside to look across regions, here's a table I pulled together for loblolly pine over-horizons across the southeastern U.S. Now, the best question I'd like to ask for the evening is, why do some of them have twice or 3 times or even 5 times the over-horizon mass of others? They're all loblolly pine forests, but they don't have the same over-horizon masses. Turns out we don't have good answers for this. We have some ideas that could be discussed, but again, this is just one more reason why the over-horizon is so beautiful to ponder. Well, in some other areas, they've pondered the over-horizon mass in more detail, and they've come up with some beautiful patterns. Here in Scandinavia, if we looked at a site that was very cold or very dry, we'd find a very small over-horizon. But the warmer we get by going south, or the greater precipitation we get by going closer to the ocean, the higher the over-horizon mass climbs. And in fact, this seems to be a pattern that applies across the world in many ways, but not uniformly. Maybe someone should work up a review sometime on why the over-horizon mass varies locally, regionally, and even globally. I hope one of you will volunteer to do that. So, over-horizons not only change over space, they change pretty fascinatingly over time. Here's a classic study from the 1970s up near Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire, where Wally Covington, one of my mentors, did his PhD study. He found that if you clear-cut a forest, the over-horizon mass dropped. Well, that makes sense because the litter fall inputs go away and the decomposition continues, so of course there's a smaller over-horizon. But the over-horizon kept dropping even after litter fall got back up to the levels it used to be, and it took decades or even centuries for that over-horizon to recover to the level it was before. But any good idea in science needs further testing, and here Ruth Yanai and colleagues went back to these same sites and resampled them, and they found that some of them behaved very nicely and followed that trajectory the Chronosequence said they should, but others, like that big one in the middle, showed tremendous changes that weren't really consistent with chronosequences. So whether our ideas of change over time really hold up or not is a question that we always want to pull up more evidence to support. Well, we can also look over time by resampling a single place repeatedly over decades, and here's a site from the Calhoun Experimental Forest that Dan Richter and colleagues have been working on lately that Carol Wells and folks had started back in the 50s. And putting trees on degraded agricultural land, turns out they grow pretty darn well, and before too long we have a large forest. And so 50 years later, let's ask, where did the carbon that's accumulated in these forests show up? Well, here's our pie chart. The big green section, there we go, shows that the majority of the carbon that accumulated here was in the trees. The second biggest pool that accumulated over time was my favorite over-horizon. It accumulated at a rate of about a megagram per hectare per year, which is a very respectable rate of carbon sequestration. And when it comes to that mineral soil, look how much it didn't change. The 0 to 60 centimeter mineral soil was essentially unchanged after 50 years. There was some additional carbon added to the uppermost mineral soil, but then there was some lost from deeper horizons, and they pretty much balanced each other out. So the story of how carbon changes in soils when forests are put onto agricultural sites is largely one of the O-horizon, at least in a majority of cases. Well, now we can go even farther back in time and look at how O-horizons change over millennia. This is a very clever set of studies that again comes from Scandinavia, where islands that are large in a big lake tend to get struck by lightning more often than islands that are small. And so large islands tend to have burned off more recently than small islands. And the O-horizons, the big. So let's see what difference that makes. David Wardle and colleagues have been measuring a variety of things on these islands, and a site that was burned 200 years ago had an O-horizon about 15 centimeters deep and a pretty reasonable biomass of 120 megagrams per hectare. Now, if we go to a medium island that burned 2,000 years ago, it's got about twice that amount of O-horizon accumulated. And going to a site that hasn't burned in more than 3,000 years, the O-horizon just kept going up. So without fire, decomposition in these northern landscapes just doesn't seem to be able to keep up with the rates of input or the processes that store carbon in these ecosystems. Here's one of my favorite conundrums about O-horizons. Decomposition turns out to be pretty rapid, whether we have a beech forest, which is that upper line in this figure, or a maple forest, which is one of the lowest lines. So the amount of carbon remaining in litter tends to go away over a period of just 3-4 years, maybe even 10 years in a slower decomposition site. But in fact, the O-horizon can have an age of its carbon that's notably older than this sort of graph might suggest. So let's have a little more explanation here. Let's imagine a site where the litter fall is 3 megagrams per hectare per year, which is a nice average rate, and 10% of it decomposes each year. Well, we do a simple spreadsheet in Excel. We can calculate how much carbon accumulates and what the average age of the material would be, which is our blue line here. The biomass would accumulate, so there were 30 tons per hectare of O-horizon mass, so a nice reasonable number. And the average age of all those atoms would be about 15 years since they fell off the tree. But on the other hand, if we take just 1% of that litter fall each year and stick it in a pool that doesn't decompose at all, we get a completely different story for our O-horizon. The mass increases to 43 tons per hectare, which is not that big an increase, but look at that average age. Now the average age of that carbon in the O-horizon is going to be over 300 years since it fell off a tree. So that short-term change in litter fall, decomposition, that's something that might fuel the nutrition of the tree in the short run. But when it comes to why soils have carbon that is so old, it's really a story that's all about that tiny, tiny fraction that doesn't decompose. It's not really a story about the carbon that decomposes within the first year or decade. So what happens if we manipulate O-horizons? What would happen if the normal inputs of organic matter were changed? Maybe we could double the above ground litter inputs, or we could trench around the edges and let that litter fall from above but not have any roots growing into the site. Well, here's a study site from Harvard Forest where they've been doing this for 20 years. And the O-horizon, if everything's working fine, the litter is falling in from above, the roots are growing in from the trees. It has a mass of about 50 megagrams per hectare, and the carbon content of that mass is a little less than 20 megagrams per hectare. Well, here's what happens if you don't let leaves fall onto that soil for 20 years. Not a whole lot, actually, is it? This is if we double the litter fall input. If you double the litter fall input, you might think the O-horizon is going to double, but in fact, it didn't go up by much, either in carbon content or mass. But now look what happens if you take away all the root inputs. You let the litter fall as it does normally, but you don't let the roots grow into this O-horizon and into the mineral soil below it. And suddenly the O-horizon begins to disappear pretty darn dramatically. Now, exactly what's going on here and why is a story that's being currently investigated. But it does show that in this case, the long-term stabilization of O-horizon material is perhaps more about the below-ground inputs than the leaves that fall off the trees. Well, within a single site, of course, we could have tree species that differ. And that ends up giving us very different O-horizons. Here's an example from Ontario where adjacent plantations of white pine and red oak. The white pine had a great O-horizon develop, but earthworms under the oak were taking that O-horizon and mixing it in with the mineral soil every year. One of these common garden experiments, this time in Siberia, showing how you can line up species and then investigate what that means for the soils below. And it turns out there are very large differences in the O-horizons that accumulate under these species, but it's not exactly clear why the birch, for example, has an O-horizon that's so much smaller than aspen. Sounds like it's a good opportunity for more investigation by scientists in the future. We know enough about the patterns to know they're interesting, but we don't yet really have complete explanations of why that accumulation differs so much. Of course, there are other interactions. Tree species influence soil animals, and these influences change over time. When that Siberian plantation was 8 or 10 years old, soil animal counts, the microarthropod densities, didn't differ much among the species. But after 30 years, the microarthropod numbers are much higher, again, because the O-horizon's been developing over time, and they're quite different among the different species. But here the birch and the aspen are rather similar, even though their masses are different. There's still a lot to be worked out about explaining these patterns in our beautiful O-horizons. So the beautiful answers that we find in scientific questions often tell us an average answer that we can apply on average anywhere we go. But in fact, our best answers also start telling us what that variation around an average should be expected to be, and maybe which factors will drive when we are above average and when we're below average. I'm going to skip over one or two of these slides that just aren't all that interesting. Taxonomy of O-horizons is something that's fascinated a number of people. 120 years ago, people were talking about mole and moor horizons. The mole horizons tended to be animal mixed, where the O-horizon is reasonably well blended into the A-horizon. The moors were organic layers that tended to sit atop A-horizons and not really be blended with them. And there were expectations that moles decompose faster, and they should recycle nutrients faster as well. But in fact, we need to think a little more clearly when we come up with generalizations like this and ask if it's true on average and how much variation there might be around those averages. So if we go into detail with these kinds of taxonomies, we might go beyond just the moor and mole distinction, in fact. And for example, Carl Klinke up in British Columbia came up with 3 orders of soils of O-horizons, added the mole and motor and moor as his orders, and then 19 groups below that, 69 subgroups below that. But I'm not really sure we can say functionally what all these different categories mean in terms of plants or other long-term soil issues that would lead us to accept a taxonomy or to leave it behind. If we came over to Europe, it turns out they've got some excitement for O-horizon classification. They have 6 major types that some people are promoting here. And in fact, some of these O-horizons, they would have the same structure and composition, but they get different names if they were overlying different kinds of mineral soils. Well, this is a pretty complicated approach, and it would be valuable if it leads us in places where we have stronger insights than we would have without these kinds of taxonomies. But whether the taxonomies really do add power to our insights, I think is a question that's worth asking. But I'm not going to be able to answer it for you, but I'll just have raised the question. Something I learned long ago from a Swedish forest ecologist, Carl Olof Tham, was that it might not be worthwhile knowing if the O-horizon mass and structure looks like a mole or a moor, because if you have the same amount of litter and roots growing into these O-horizons, and they're both in steady state with respect to mass, then the current rate of decomposition, be it 10% or 20%, doesn't really matter, because a fast decomposing O-horizon has very few years of litter there to decompose and provide nutrients. A slowly decomposing O-horizon has many years of slowly releasing materials, and so you add up to the same amount of supply for the trees. So we might not want to generalize too heavily about fast versus slow decomposition. Another example, moor and moles. Well, if the moles turn over faster, nutrient supply should be higher. Well, here's a study in Quebec that found that when maple trees were growing on sites with more O-horizons, those O-horizons that sit atop the A-horizon, the phosphorus nutrition of the trees was much better than when the trees were growing on sites that had that O horizon blended in with the A horizon. And that was probably because mixing of the mineral soil was exposing those phosphorus atoms to iron, and of course that was precipitating the P in more difficult to access pools, whereas when the P was kept in the organic cycle in the moor systems, the trees could access it better. So again, we don't want to generalize beyond really what the evidence might be ready to support for us. Here's an example where I just wanted to emphasize the circularity of how O horizons and other pieces of the system fit together. Here's a site with a variety of tree species that were planted in Poland, and earthworm biomass tends to be high when the O horizon mass is low. And that's no surprise since we expect the earthworms are going to be mixing the O horizon into the A horizon. But in terms of cause and effect, when the earthworm biomass is high, the pH is high. When the earthworm biomass is low, the pH is low. But are the worms changing the pH of the O horizon, or is the pH of the O horizon determining the success or failure of the worm populations? Similarly, we can look at the O horizon mass and how it relates to the O horizon pH. And again, we find a nice pattern. And so anytime we ask a question in soils, we don't necessarily want to expect A causes B. We always want to think about that feedback loop where B then influences A. Changes in O horizons happen when we do things in forests, such as cut down trees. And here's a great example from a long-term site productivity study that was started by Bob Powers and joined in by dozens of other scientists across Canada and the US, where they have a fairly standard design applied to see what happens when you harvest forests, but also when you manipulate the amount of organic material left behind. So across this big gradient, they have some sites that are very cool with very low precipitation, some sites that are warmer with high precipitation, and then a lot of variation within any one of these environmental driving factors. So the basic design called for modifying site organic matter, and one treatment was just to cut down the trees and take away the stems as usual. The crowns were left behind. The understory, if it was present, was mowed down or cut up. And the O horizon, which they were calling the forest floor here, was left intact. Or all the above ground vegetation was removed, including the leaves and the branches, but again, that O horizon was retained. And then they had a more creative treatment where all the surface organic matter was removed. Well, for me, I would be saying that the O horizon was removed, the bare soil was exposed. In this case, it was really the bare mineral soil that was exposed. So this last treatment, it turns out that that really is very different than the others because we're not just taking off organic matter with this treatment. You're essentially skinning the soil. Taking off the living skin of the soil, it's like ripping the epidermis off the soil. That's not the same as having cut off the trees that were standing high in the sky. So removing the slash turned out to be a lot like shaving off a beard. It's dead material. If you retain slash after logging or you take the on these sites later. But if they skinned off the O horizon, it turns out the plants trying to grow on this site after the treatment had only about half as much nitrogen to work with because the top of the soil was skinned off. So again, the O horizon is not biomass, it's part of the soil. Prescribed burning. It turns out you burn a site and it's often the O horizon or a substantial portion of the O horizon that goes up in smoke. Here's an example from Arizona where before a fire the O horizon mass was about 30 megagrams per hectare, and burning the site took off a reasonable amount of material, as you might expect, but then 7 months later an additional 4 megagrams per hectare of that O horizon had disappeared. And this had implications for the nitrogen budget. Before the fire, after the fire, there was some nitrogen loss from the O horizon in the fire, which is not unusual. But then 7 months later, an extra 100 kilograms of nitrogen had disappeared from that O horizon, probably going into the mineral soil and into the plants. But the important thing here is that the effect of the fire wasn't just to consume the O horizon. There was something about O horizon behavior and structure and function that was dramatically changed by the fire. And this is just another quick example of the same kind of study, but this time with loblolly pine in the southeast. And again, there was great decomposition, disappearance of the O horizon after the burning had ceased. And again, another slug of nitrogen came available for the trees or other plants to use, not because of the fire immediately, but because of the legacy the fire had on what's going on with the O-horizon. Here are a few more recent things about O-horizons that, again, I think are beautiful and fascinating. Here's an example from a Scots pine soil here in Sweden, where the fungal community that we find in the soil is very different depending on how we move down through that O-horizon and into the A-horizon or the E-horizon. If we're in the upper part of the O-horizon, the fungal community is dominated by those blue bars, which are the saprophytes. Those are the fungi that live by decomposing organic material in the soil. The black bars, which become much more prominent as we move down into the more processed material in the O-horizon and in fact down into the E and the B, those are the mycorrhizal fungi who make a living by getting their carbon from the trees. And so even though the total amount of fungal biomass was somewhat consistent with depth in this soil, the nature of the ways those fungi were making a living changed completely as we go through the O-horizon and into mineral soil. Functionally, there's some really cool things that we're finding out about mycorrhizae and O-horizons. Here's an example where nitrogen 15 was added to the O-horizon of a forest. And then we'd expect the mycorrhizae might take up that nitrogen 15 and they might feed it to the trees. And so in this first example, which we're calling a control, this is the nitrogen 15 that makes it into the microbial biomass, including the hyphae of those mycorrhizal fungi. And the days since labeling, the label gets into the microbial community and it sort of stays there a while. And in fact, if we look at the trees, not much of that tracer made it up into the trees over the first month after that nitrogen 15 was added to the O-horizon. But what happens if that O-horizon was enriched in nitrogen with a fertilizer a couple months before this tracer was applied? So in that case, there'd be a pretty good supply of nitrogen to the microbes in the trees, and now we can ask, when additional nitrogen is added, labeled with N15, what happens to the microbial uptake and transfer to the trees? It turns out that those microbes took up that nitrogen that was added, but because they'd already been pretty satiated for their nitrogen needs, they didn't hang on to it, and in fact they passed that nitrogen on to the trees very adequately. And so here we have an interesting conundrum developing in this O-horizon and the upper mineral soil, where the role of the mycorrhizae in feeding the trees that are in fact feeding them might be pretty variable based on the nitrogen nutrition of the site overall. If it's a low nitrogen site, those mycorrhizae may be a little bit on the parasitic end of the spectrum, but if there's a good amount of nitrogen, then they're going to feed the trees. This is just an initial study from one site, and clearly we need many more artists out there painting these beautiful O-horizons to figure it out. So I want to begin wrapping up and save time for some of our questions by emphasizing that these O-horizons are really alive. They're not like the dead slash that we have laying on top of the soil after a logging operation. Sure, there's dead organic matter in them, but they're also full of life. Here's a picture of the mycorrhizal hyphae growing around the roots and the little club roots that are developed there with the mycorrhizal nets wrapped around them. And a colleague of mine, Peter Hoagberry, phrased it very eloquently that we might want to fragment the soil-plant system into thinking about plants or thinking about soils. And maybe that's okay sometimes, but we need to recognize that soils and plants are connected almost as integrally as our own arteries and veins are. Those capillaries that connect our arteries and our veins forming one system are very much like those microbial connections that happen in the O-horizons and in the mineral horizons too. And we really have to have a holistic physiological approach to trying to understand all the beauty that's going on in these O-horizons and how they change over time and over space. So this is an O-horizon, the characteristic horizon of forest soils. And in case you missed it, this is a forest floor. We don't want to mix up those two things, because if you call it a forest floor, people aren't going to automatically realize you're talking soil. And so, it looks like Sergey's getting a little bit tired of my talk, so maybe I should finish this up and see if we can move on to some good questions. So I thought I'd let Sergey have the last words, and it turns out after I decided to make this wild lecture an ode to the O-horizon, I came upon this ode quite independently that Sergey had written about an ode to forest soils. He wrote, "I bury me deep in the moldy earth and sprinkle me well with lime, where I can rest in deep, sweet peace until the end point of time." And that brings me to the end point of time for the presentation part. Well, we've got 15 minutes or so left, and I hope that some of you will have questions that we can discuss and maybe have some useful ideas about. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Dan, and I'll take a moment here for let people think about their questions, enter that online, and if there's any questions here in the room, we can certainly take those at any time. We do have a question online, and the question is, has there been any research or experiments on living forests with O-horizons removed versus natural conditions with relation to stream flow? This would truly tell the story of the O-horizon benefits by removing the ET effect.
That's a great question, and there's certainly been studies like that at a plot scale where people have measured soil water content and tree growth and other features, but I don't know of anyone that's tried it at a large enough scale where we could detect a watershed effect that would show up in the streams. On the one hand, that would be very interesting science. On the other hand, though, I wonder what the people who own the forest might think of that kind of treatment. But that doesn't always stop science, so perhaps we should try it. Maybe at the Fraser Experimental Forest we can talk our colleagues into trying it.
Any other questions? Yeah, if you would, come over here closer to the phone.
Hi, Dan. This is Zamir from National Soil Survey Center. I actually did my master's there with Lee McDonald, working on the effects of fires on runoff and erosion in the Front Range. And I remember when I would be up in the forest, we would always call that duff and litter. So we were not kind of showing much respect for this O-horizon. And when that fire came, it really shaved the whole thing. It took not just the litter, but also took the whole organic matter. It burned it. It shaved it, like you said. And the runoff and the erosion was tremendous. So I mean, I kind of and when I was going there and digging this, I would see this well separated duff and litter that was not decomposed, but then right at the interface with the soil, I would see this little transition that was not soil, was not either litter. It was somewhere in between. So, I mean, my question is this: when we describe soil horizons in our soil science discipline, we are usually referring to some sort of a genetic or pedogenic process. We recognize that. So when it comes to the O-horizon, though, I personally haven't seen any good way of describing it morphologically so that it makes sense to a soil scientist that goes in the field and kind of uses a well-defined terminology to describe what it is that would represent some processes that are taking place there. And I would say, for example, when we talk about terms like structure or texture and other things, how would we, what would be the terminology to use to describe this correctly? Because as you pointed out in your presentation, there is so much variability in the forms that you would see this, in the thickness and in the characteristics that it will appear to. So, I mean, I don't know. That's my question, I guess. I mean, how would you characterize it so it's meaningful to soil scientists as well?
That's a particularly good question about taxonomy in general. We can start taking the variety of structures we're faced with in any subject area, and we can start breaking them down into categories. And sometimes those categories, like species of birds, are really solid and really useful. But in other cases, like the horizons of soils, it's not quite clear that there are dramatic categories that things fit in, and yet we still find it useful to classify them into different groupings, because in broad ways, these different groupings we create are useful. Well, the people who've tried to do the same thing with O-horizons have come up with many different categories based on structure and appearances, and sometimes even the feel of the greasiness of the material that's accumulated as humus. But exactly how useful those are is a challenge that I think remains for us to really investigate. If we find that the structure looks pretty different, there's got to be a story there, but whether it's a story that conveys information and power to us that let us do better jobs of managing forests or something is a question that I think we really ought to dive into in more detail. And thanks for all that work on the Front Range and the fires, by the way. I rely on that information a lot in presentations.
All right, we've got the questions coming in online now. So here's one from Jim Boyle. Greetings, Dan from Corvallis. Do you think the Klinka Nordic classification descriptions might better represent processes than the EIEIO system of U.S. classification?
Yeah, the EIEIO system, I don't know how useful it is. Sometimes we break it up into those categories, and then we can measure some features of one layer versus another. But exactly how we get those layers and what it means if one site has more of one layer but less of a different layer, again, those interpretations, I'm just not sure we know what they are. And so until we can get into that interpretation side, I don't know if lots of extra classification categories will lead to better insights than we have with the simple 3-layer categories. And perhaps people who focus more on these O horizons in detail would be good to pull them together in a workshop and have them really come up with the insights they think these classification schemes could lead us to. But personally, I don't really know at this point how valuable a better classification scheme would be.
Next question, is the destruction of O horizons by earthworms ubiquitous, or is that just a Midwest phenomenon?
It depends on the species of earthworms we're talking about. And so in areas where people have brought in worms for fishing, the classic earthworm Lumbricus terrestris from Europe, it turns out that just about anywhere you drop them, they tend to blend that O horizon into the A horizon and convert the O horizon into a mole category. And so there are beautiful places in Michigan and New York where there's a wave front of these worms moving into the forest away from where the fishermen drop them by the stream side or the lake side. And you can watch the O horizons disappear literally year after year as the worms move farther out. But of course, there are other worms that are native to different parts of the world, and not all of them come up and blend that O horizon quite as well as the Lumbricus does.
What was the longer-term trajectory of carbon and nitrogen after the burning and immediate period that followed?
That's a good question. For those particular sites, I don't know the answer, but there have been some other sites I'm more familiar with where they would come back and burn a loblolly pine site annually, every 2 years or every 4 years, and see how the horizons change. And at one of these sites in South Carolina, it turns out the total carbon in the soil was unaffected after 30 years by any of these burning regimes. But by burning frequently, the O horizon was very small or non-existent, and the A horizon had very high carbon in it. But on the other hand, when it was burned every 4 years, that allowed the O horizon to rebuild and be maintained. But then the A horizon beneath had less carbon. And so, but again, I wouldn't take it one study in one location and try to extrapolate it too far. But I think these are good questions that need to be followed up.
In commercial forest harvesting, is there any advantage to leaving stumps, logs, etc., to promoting or helping the ecosystem?
That's definitely a question that's very important. Again, here in Scandinavia, where they're providing about a quarter of Sweden's energy needs from biomass harvesting, it's a big question. Should you harvest the stumps? Should you take any woody debris that's on the ground? And in fact, there's a large project going on with Finnish collaborators studying exactly what happens when stumps are harvested. Many people think there is value, and there's accumulating evidence that leaving that material behind does matter, but I think the evidence is not fully synthesized yet to tell us how big a deficit we'd be running by enhancing the amount of material we remove, especially something like stumps. But I think in 5 to 10 years we'll have better information about stump harvesting.
Next question, could you please relate O horizons to forest soil health in terms of mitigation of atmospheric deposition?
One thing they found in Europe, where they have much higher rates of nitrogen deposition from rainfall and snow than we do in North America, is that a lot of it accumulates in the O horizon. if people look at what's changed in European soils over the last 30 to 40 years, it's primarily the O-horizon has increased. The carbon to nitrogen ratio of the O-horizon will have also changed. And what implications this has for tree nutrition or long-term site fertility, I think those are still open questions. But it does seem like these O-horizons are the focal point of how atmospheric deposition influences whatever happens later in forests.
Has there been much research concerning invasive worms that are destroying forest O-horizons?
There has been. Some scientists in New York at the Cary Arboretum have done work there, and a fellow named Rich Phillips, who's over in Indiana now, has done work on it. And basically they're finding that the worms do mix in that O-horizon, and it's not clear that there's a large increase or decrease in nutrient supply or soil fertility. So right now there's been a lot of characterization of how the changes develop, but what the implications are still needs more time and more.
Well, we lost the audio on that last part of the comment. Are you still there?
I am, I think. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. The
Okay.
very last part got dropped off.
I'm sorry, I didn't go away, but so the pattern has now been well documented, but what the implications are, especially in the long run, is still a good question.
Next question. How does the O-horizon change with soil wetness condition? For example, how do wetland areas differ from the somewhat poorly drained or moderately well-drained area within the same forest?
I don't know if there's a firm generalization that's supported yet or not. My impression is that generally the wetter the site, the more that O-horizon tends to accumulate. And exactly why that is, if it's a difference in root activity and what the roots are doing in the O-horizon and for the overall biogeochemistry, or if it's the above ground litter just kind of sits on the lower parts of the landscape when the wind blows better than on the higher parts of the landscape, I don't know. I think generally there's more O-horizon when it gets wetter, but that'd be a good question to investigate too.
What kind of variability occurs in O-horizon attributes with regard to the time of year that the horizon is sampled? In other words, sampling in October versus sampling in June.
Mm-hmm. This pretty much depends on how large the O-horizon mass is to begin with. If it's a very thin O-horizon, it may well be one that gets mixed perhaps even annually by the earthworms. And so in October there may be an O-horizon, but in August that may be completely gone. But if there's a larger O-horizon, several inches thick, well then that's not getting mixed in each year, and it tends to be the accumulation of materials from several years. And in that case, sampling in one season or another wouldn't give much difference in the total mass.
Can some of the differences in thickness of the O in a stand or plot be due to leaf or needle fall, particularly in terms of adjacency to individual trees?
It can. The adjacency to individual trees may not be too important because by the time the litter begins to fall, if there's any kind of wind blowing, it can redistribute it. But if there's a little bit of a hill, then more litter certainly accumulates on the uphill side of a tree. Or if there's has been a wind throw where a tree has gone down and now we have pit and mound topography, the pits will accumulate lots of O-horizon and the mounds will tend to accumulate very little. So there is quite a lot of variation spatially that relates to microtopography.
What relationship have you observed in variation of O-horizon condition and infiltration and ET rates?
Infiltration certainly seems to be very well related to the O-horizon. The infiltration capacity of O-horizons is often 10 times greater than most mineral soils are. And exactly what that means for evapotranspiration, I wouldn't be surprised if some work's been done there, but I can't call any to mind that I could really speak usefully about.
So if O-horizon development is not governed by litter quality, is it controlled by root exudate quality or even just the area of root distribution, or is it related more to the base status or nitrogen status of the surface horizon?
I really think we should get a bunch of folks together and have a bit of brainstorming about why exactly these O-horizons have the kinds of patterns behind them they do. those are some great ideas and some great possibilities, but I just don't know if we're ready to have conclusions about them.
All right, next question. Have underlying mineral soil characteristics been investigated as a predictor for O-horizon dynamics, especially when species is controlled like the loblolly plantations?
Not that I know of, but that would be a very interesting place to start. It's easy to imagine that a very nutrient-rich A-horizon might have a different kind of O-horizon above it than a very nutrient-poor A-horizon. So that might be a good place to start for investigating that region-wide pattern in loblolly pine O-horizons.
Next question. What are the hazards to the soil from composting?
I'm not really sure. If we look at a soil from one year to the next or one season to the next, there are all kinds of dynamics that are happening, and composting is just one more kind of dynamic that can be taking place in the soil. And I can imagine it would have a variety of effects. But soils are pretty dynamic systems anyway, so I don't know that I could generalize about that.
Another question. What do you think about humic acid measurements? Do you believe that this measurement would have a useful application in O-horizon development and classification?
It could, and many people have done studies characterizing the humic acid and other organic chemistry occurring in these O-horizons. My understanding of current thinking, though, is that the recalcitrance of organic molecules in soils may not be as tightly related to classic chemistry as we used to think it was. I've heard people say that the classic humic acids and fulvic acids and the humin, which was the leftover, not very soluble in acid or base, that those categories may have more to do with our methods of extracting than they do with the actual dynamics of organic matter in the field. So humic acid measurements, I wouldn't be surprised if that would differ among O-horizon types. But at this point, from what I hear from organic matter specialists, it's a pretty murky topic and an exciting topic of current work.
You got time for a couple more questions?
I've got lots of time. The sun won't come up for another 18 hours.
What is your understanding of the effect of extensive earthworm invasion, such as Lumbricus terrestris, in previously earthworm-free soils, and how this will affect the forest ecosystem?
My expectation is that it's going to have large effects, but I have to say the empirical evidence right now is still coming in, and so I wouldn't have a lot of confidence in what my best conclusions would be. But as that example shows with the mull versus more organic horizons and the sugar maple, the phosphorus nutrition of trees may well change if that O-horizon is blended in with the A-horizon. Other changes that we might expect is that fungal hyphae are kind of like the capillaries in our bloodstream, where they connect things together and they can stick around for a while. And when those worms come along, we get much more mixing. That seems to favor bacterial activity and disfavor fungal activity. And fungi and bacteria are quite different in how they affect overall biogeochemistry. So lots of reasons to think that these earthworm changes may be quite large and long-lasting. But on the other hand, we're still getting more information that's going to inform our conclusions better in 5 or 10 years.
And would it be correct to think that selective harvesting of forests would be best practice since roots seem to be such a significant factor?
Again, you could get a variety of experts to argue this, and they'd come out on different sides of the argument. Empirically, if we clear-cut a site and we plant trees on it, the trees do tend to grow pretty well in the next generation. So it's not clear that we're imperiling things by having all the trees removed at once. On the other hand, there's some very good reasons why keeping that soil ecosystem well supplied with fresh carbohydrates from living trees could be a very good idea in the long run. And so this is an area of sizable debate and a reasonable amount of accumulating evidence. And in fact, during my time that I get to spend here in Sweden, this is a topic that some colleagues and I hope to review. Here they're calling it continuous cover forestry versus clear cutting. And there's a lot of pressure to move towards continuous cover because it sounds like a better idea. But we'd like to dig into the evidence and see how much better an idea it is.
Well, Dan, that's exhausted all the questions people submitted, and just want to thank you for a very interesting webinar and an excellent job answering all these questions. Just thank you so much.
Well, thanks for putting up with me trying to talk to myself here, sitting in a little room and imagining the audience out there. It's a novel experience.
Thanks again, Dan.